Hey, this is Professor Esch, and I'd like to talk to you for a few minutes about the impact of modernism on the United States. We've not discussed the United States much outside of one lecture that we did on kind of American exceptionalism during the Victorian period. But in the 20th century, the United States becomes the richest and most powerful country in the world. And so we spend a lot of time talking about England in the 19th century. And in the 20th century, I think it's appropriate to talk about the United States. Now, there's a sense in which Americans at the turn of the century recognized that they were going to become something more significant. Um, so there's actually a little known Christian periodical called the Christian Oracle that in 1900 renames itself the Christian century, prophesying that the 20th century would become the century in which the world would sort of become fundamentally Christian. Now, I've always seen this retitling as strangely prophetic. The world, and indeed the United States, undergoes profound intellectual and moral changes in the 20th century. The 20th century is when America goes from being a rural nation of farmers to an urban nation of computer programmers and kind of technologists. It's a century in which we go from essentially being a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant country to a multicultural, pluralistic religious country in which all religions are sort of celebrated and none are celebrated. It's a country in which our foreign policy radically changes from being a nation where we were committed to forging our own way and not entangling ourselves in the diplomatic affairs of the world to one in which we were the superpower, indeed the hegemon, the only power that could project military affairs globally at the mid-century mark. But then it's strangely prophetic because the Americans also become deeply secular in the 20th century, at least among our elites. It's often remarked of the United States that we are a nation of Indians, meaning the Indian subcontinent, we're as religious as the Indians, governed by a Swedish elite, an entirely secular kind of. So the Christian century is it is the American century in so many ways, and yet not the Christian century. So let's unpack that and talk about what that looks like and what it meant. And to do that, here I want to drop the quiz question for the week. Okay, so focus. I'm interested in the way in which World War I fostered modernism. Now, you can get definitions for modernism from the previous lecture that the literary and artistic scholar did. And I'm interested in that. You can really have a sense that modernism predates World War I. Virginia Woolf said in 1910 that it seemed like human nature changed its meaning about 1910, that the intellectual elites began to behave more and more like Oscar Wilde and less like their Victorian grandparents. In America, I'm not sure that we really were modern before World War I. There are hints of it. There's a really famous art exhibition in New York City in 1913 called the Armory Show, in which some of the modern art and painting come to America, including a famous picture by Albert Duchamp. But by and large, Americans don't understand it. The New York Times actually satirized that the Duchamp piece was entitled Nude Descending a Staircase. And it was a kind of cubist images sort of, and the New York Times satirized it as a sort of an explosion in a shingle factory. It made no sense. But by 1922, Willa Cather wrote that it seemed like about 1922, human nature, like the world had cracked in two. Something fundamental had changed. And I do think this is connected to the war. During the war, remember, 20 million people die. It's a total war. It's a war fought with modern weapons and modern technology. It's a war fought to make the world safe for democracy, and yet it doesn't. And it's a war fought for nationalism and high courage and high moral ideals. But in fact, plenty of Americans a decade after the war would say with Ernest Hemingway, Hemingway says in his A Farewell to Arms, I had seen nothing sacred, and the sacrifices were like the stockyards of Chicago if nothing was done with the meat except to bury it. Abstract words such as glory, honor, courage, and hallow were obscene words. That's kind of what I would say I mean by modernism. And here I'm going to make 2 points about this academically and intellectually in terms of the sciences. And then I'll probably shift to American pop culture where I'm on much sounder footing. And again, your goal for a quiz is to just sort of sketch out for me what you think. How does the war help to bring about modernism? And then this is presumably what we'll talk about on Friday in relation to Rebecca West's novel. Okay, but there's a sense in which I think intellectually the world is already radically changing, and the war sort of brings brings home transitions that are already taking place in science, right? So think about, you see one of these pictures that you see here is Sigmund Freud. Sigmund Freud believed in a kind of human nature, just like Kant did, just like Isaac Newton had. But think about, if you know anything about Freudian psychology, Freud says we're actually not dominated by our conscious mind. We're dominated by our subconscious, by things that sort of lay underneath the surface. And we kind of were driven by these sexual instincts and these Oedipal urges and these, that we're a bundle of neuroses, the human creatures are. And so the human mind, the human nature is actually fundamentally subjective. It's not rooted in reason, it's rooted in something sort of deeper and under the surface. And Freud, paired with sort of Nietzsche's turning critical reason on critical reason, um, paired with these two, in the 20th century, modern thinkers began to really question whether or not anything was knowable with the kind of certainty that science claimed. And science itself seems like it's blowing up old orthodoxies. In the late 19th century, physicists actually started to complain that being a physicist was now boring. You're sort of living in the age of Newton still, but all of the old sort of theories about matter and motion and mechanics have been discovered. Only to sort of then at the turn of the century have this young Viennese Jew, Albert Einstein, just blow the world wide open. Einstein posits his general theory of relativity, E equals mc squared, which I think everybody knows the basics idea of, right? Energy equals the mass of something times the speed of light squared. And the idea there is that there's a constant in the universe, it's the speed of light. But the things that we were thought of as constants, matter, emotion, and like energy, are in fact changeable into one another. You can plug one out and plug the other in. So Einstein posits his theory of relativity as a way to say that lots of things actually are subjective. Now, and Einstein himself is a scientist who believes that there are laws that make sense of everything, and he's famous for saying God does not play dice. This is not a random universe. But people sort of draw on Einstein's insights to insist that, well, maybe science fundamentally can't tell us things anymore, right? And it seems like we are much smaller in the world, and the material world is much smaller than it had been. Above the Einstein picture is the picture of Professor Hubble, who develops the Hubble. He sort of discovers that there are other galaxies out there beyond the Milky Way galaxy. And you sort of begin to realize that the human creature on side this planet, about 2/3 of the way out on a spiral arm in the Milky Way galaxy, is just an infinitesimally small creature. And it reinforces this notion of subjectivity that I don't think Einstein would have embraced, right? And then in the 1920s, you see the development of, see this equation here, is sort of the Heisenberg uncertainty principle put into an equation. So Warren Heisenberg did these experiments, and the principle here is that you can know the position of an electron, you can know the velocity of an electron, but you can't really nail down both of those two things at the same time. This is the foundation of quantum physics. And the idea in quantum physics is further kind of refined, that the experimenter actually has an impact on the things that are being experimented upon. That there is no such thing as an impartial observer in particle physics. the act of measuring something changes the answer that you're looking for. So again, there's this sort of the things aren't as hard and fast as they seem. And in fact, the human creature is far more small and subjective. Now, just like we did with Darwin, I want to suggest that there's a kind of, the social scientists get a hold of Darwin's theory and transform it into something that wasn't fully intended, right? So you see the emergence in human sciences of sociology, anthropology, and economics, this renewed belief that, well, if the human creature is subjective, maybe cultures are just fundamentally subjective. And you see this in the pervasive work of an American anthropologist, really the second generation of professional American anthropologists, Margaret Mead. Margaret Mead produced what was in the 1920s and 30s, a sort of gospel about culture and society. And it fit within this new sort of modernist framework. Mead wrote a really famous, you might even say infamous book called Coming of Age in American Samoa. And she developed the idea, rooted in Freud, that we were all sort of a bundle of our subconscious urges, but she asserted that Americans are actually far more repressed. So the idea that she wanted to develop was the idea of cultural relativism, that each culture has its own morality, and that no one culture is better than the other. But in comparing the cultures of, say, American Samoa, these islands in the Pacific, and the continental United States, she really did take sides in the book, and she asserted that the Samoan culture was in fact far better than the American culture. Now, what makes this a bit controversial, and I'm always sort of reluctant to get into too much detail about it, but this is about coming of age rituals, and she posited that young people in Samoa, in what she would have called a primitive or traditional society, were in fact far more sexually free than young people in an American society. So growing up in a kind of late Victorian modernist society, young people were taught to kind of go through the proper courtship rituals and avoid relationships avoid having sex before they were married. And Mead wanted to say, well, look, in Samoa, they don't do this. And for a long time, this was considered proof of cultural relativism, and that there were actually no kind of cultural absolutes. This was deeply kind of believed. And then in the 1950s, an anthropologist so moved by this pioneer of anthropology went back to Samoa, and maybe this wasn't the 50s, maybe this was the 70s, but Eric Friedman went back to Samoa and attempted to recreate the experiment. And so he looked around for these ideas and actually couldn't find them at all. It seemed like in traditional society, coming of age rituals weren't all that different from anywhere else in the world. And certainly it didn't seem like women in Samoa and women in the United States were that different. In fact, in America in the 1970s, American women seemed much less repressed, quote unquote, than in Samoa. And so Freeman puzzled about this, and he muddled around a bit, and eventually he started interviewing Mead's original subjects, who had been teenagers in the 1920s, and some of them are still around in the 60s and 70s when he's interested in the project. And he sort of asks them the same questions, and eventually they sort of awkwardly admit to Freeman that she was really credulous and really wanted them to tell stories. So they kind of made the whole thing up. There was no way to replicate this because this in fact hadn't been true. So I say this to tell you, like, Mead's research today actually doesn't tell us all that much about Samoa or about the differences between culture. In fact, it would seem to me that there are rules about sort of sexual ethics that are somewhat persistent across cultures, that, you know, modesty might take different forms in different cultures, but there's a principle of it that seems to adhere across cultures. It just means different things in different places, but it might be a cultural universal. But Mead's Mead's book was taken as gospel in the 1930s as demonstrating that morality was something that was fundamentally subjective and in fact maybe not rooted. And you can find other scholars, like the American journalist Walter Lippmann infamously wrote this book, infamous in my mind. He writes a preface to Morals, essentially saying, well, you know, there is no, in our modern society, we now know that there is no sort of foundation for morality. Nietzsche has taught us this. But so what we need to do is sort of boldly invent what we think is going to be a socially useful morality. Um, and yeah, so something really is happening among American intellectuals in the 1920s, even though it doesn't seem to describe what's happening in American culture. Now, in American culture as a whole, there's a fundamental disconnect in America. And this is sort of the puzzle of America in the 20th century. So American intellectuals in the 1920s very much are envious of their European um, artistic avant-garde provocateurs, and Hemingway and Gertrude Stein go off to Paris and attempt to become as European as possible. And American social scientists attempt, citing Einstein badly, to develop a sort of American cultural relativism. What's actually happening in America? I mean, America is becoming the richest and most powerful country in the world. Here you see a picture of the four most powerful men in America, I think, in the 1920s. Maybe not, but would you see here? And I'm not even sure if you recognize them. I'm always curious as to see if students who know who they are, right? This is Henry Ford, who's powerful because of his control of Ford Motors, and he's figured out how to make cars more cheaply than anyone in the world. This is Thomas Alva Edison, inventor of the phonograph and the incandescent light bulb, leader of General Electric, and really the person who's done more to bring in this kind of technological modernity than anyone else in the world. Yeah, and this is President Warren Harding, who's sort of creating this business-friendly climate for America. He's sort of returning America back to laissez-faire economics after a long period of kind of government intervention. And this is Harvey Firestone, who makes Firestone tires. And honestly, yeah, Harvey Firestone's not that big of a deal. He's sort of a derivative, influential person because he sells a lot of tires because Ford is selling a lot of them. But this is a sort of age of American capitalism. And this is a sort of puzzle. The last time we talked about economic theory in a major way, we talked about Karl Marx and Marx's idea that American capitalism, but capitalism was sort of leading inexorably toward this revolution, and it seems not to have happened. And so by 1920, socialism has not taken hold in America, which is the most industrial country in the world, and people are trying to figure out why. In fact, it seems like America's in this economic boom in the 1920s. You can see the data there on the screen. The gross domestic product increases from 574 billion, no, 74.1 billion to 103.1 billion across this prosperous period of the 1920s. That's a 40% rise in one decade. It's frankly stunning. And what happens is actually not what Marx predicted. Marx predicted the concentration of wealth in the hands of a few, and the poor would become poorer and more proletariat. And in fact, what you see is an explosion of the middle class. Per capita income rises across this time period from $670 per person to $865 per person. So much money is being produced in this economy that even though the war is just broken out, there's a massive budget surplus in America and they slash taxes. And if you try and figure out why, I mean, it does indeed seem that there's sort of logic to technology as it's unfolding. There are all of these new industries that emerge. The automobile revolutionizes transportation, and 1 in 5 Americans now owns their own car, 1 in 5 families. There's a chemicals industry, there's an electronics industry, there's radio, there's records, there's electric lights. There are all of these companies that emerge. Henry Ford, DuPont Chemicals, Union Carbide making batteries. But what's stunning about this is that workers seem to share in the prosperity. There are weak sectors in the economy. I mean, the farm sector is being rapidly modernized as people buy tractors. But by and large, I think it's clear that things are dramatically different. And this is not what Marx predicted. Marx predicted the consolidation of wealth, and that does seem to be the case. About half of the wealth in America is controlled by 250 different branch banks. And half of the non-banking wealth is controlled by about 200 corporations. But functionally what you see are monopolies, not monopolies, but they're oligarchies, and they're interlocking. And increasingly, most of the sort of factory workers in America are beginning to participate in stock options. And as wealth becomes available to the investing class, middle class America starts mortgaging their houses and going out and buying stock to participate in the stock market boom. Now, in 1929, it crashes, and people are really upset about it, and that leads to a crisis of capitalism. but it doesn't seem like the poor are getting poorer. In fact, the middle class experiences shows demonstrated rises in industrial prosperity. Um, and so modernism sort of tries to make its peace with, I mean, they would say, well, it seems like Marx was wrong. And maybe technology is the solution. Maybe technology is the thing that's going to lead us into affluence. Now, I would submit that the reason Marx is wrong has to do with the story of the life of a man named Henry Ford. So I'm going to actually pause for a sec, and I'm back. Truth be told, I'm recording this in the evening, and I'm trying to simultaneously manage recording the lecture and making sure that my kids know that they're supposed to go to bed when they're told. So, all right, back to the lecture. All right, so Henry Ford. Henry Ford is an example of what 19th century Americans would have called a Horatio Alger story. Horatio Alger wrote children's books in America that at one point were massively popular, and it's an American myth. It's an American, maybe romantic idea of this heroic individual who, through hard work and entrepreneurship and ingenuity, is able to catapult themselves from rags to riches. I mean, we read the Frederick Douglass story as the story of the self-made man. Henry Ford is such a self-made man. Um, he he um he specifically develops the strategy of making automobiles more efficiently than anyone would have dreamed possible. So he is a kind of he's a case study of what we might call the second industrial revolution. And his factories were moderately efficient, right? In 1913, before World War I, it took his factory 12.5 hours to assemble an automobile. You might have the same team of people working on the automobile, doing all of the parts and taking all of them, assembling them together. And by the 1920s, he'd gotten it down where it took 93 minutes to make a car. There's a car actually coming off the assembly line in a different part of the factory every 24 seconds. It's fast, but essentially really boring. So instead of like learning how to assemble the car from pieces, everyone focuses and specializes on one part of the assembly line. I worked in a car manufacturing plant when I was a college student, and I was responsible for a part of the steering column. And I worked on Toyota Camrys, and there were these bolts that they put in Toyota Camrys that if you got into an accident, the bolts would crush and the steering wheel would collapse so that you won't die. And that's literally all I would do. I would work on this assembly line for 8 hours a day. I was working third shift. It was the middle of the night. In fact, if you own a Toyota Camry from 1996, 97, I would advise you to sell this because like probably the safety features are defective because I was making it at 3 or 4 in the morning. But funny thing, the wages were pretty good. They made so much money on the car that they could afford to pay me well. And this is, in fact, Ford's insight. Ford understands that in order to really make enough cars to become phenomenally wealthy, he can't just make them as luxury goods for the rich. He needs to make as many cars as he can and to sell them as low as he can. But that's not enough. In order to sell the millions of cars, he has to change the way he treats his workers. And this is what we call Fordism. The process of like managing the time to make the industrial process as efficient as possible was something that an engineer named Frederick Taylor designed, and that's called Taylor's scientific management. But like that's important to the second industrial revolution. But the key is Fordism, understanding that your worker is a consumer. So let's talk about how many cars he sells, right? So in 1913, he's selling 500,000 cars a year. This is a lot. But by 1920, it's 2 million cars a year. And by 1929, it's 4.5 million cars a year. And he accelerates production at the same time he drops price. A car costs $950 in 1909, which is more than most families can afford. By 1925, it costs 260 bucks, which is enough that most families can afford to really buy a car if they're upper middle class. Ford says, I will make a car for the multitude. It will be so low in price that no man making a good salary will be unable to own one. Enjoy with his family the blessing of hours of pleasure in God's open spaces. Now, that idea that a working man is entitled to hours of pleasure in God's open spaces, it's kind of romantic. It's kind of this idea that we're entitled to beauty in our lives. And it's also fundamentally sort of not what Marx would have imagined. I mean, who would have thought that a major manufacturer would treat his workers so well? But this is Ford's like, treat your workers so well that they can afford to buy your car. And if you live in a country where the working class can afford to buy an automobile, then you can sell more automobiles than you can imagine. So when Ford implements this in 1914, he comes into his factory, announces to everyone that he's doubling their wages and that he's going to reduce the working day from 9 hours to 8 hours a day, which would allow him to sort of run the factory around the clock in 3 shifts. And he sort of figures out that if this works, I'm still making so much money that I can afford to double everyone's wages. And this is what we call welfare capitalism. With it comes these new sort of features. You see a culture of prosperity emerge. Ford has a pension plan. Ford has a health insurance program. Ford might even have stock options. You get 5.5 hours a day. And it begins to create this leisure culture for the American working class. You now have many more hours of spare time, you have more money than you ever had, and you can begin to think about how do you want to spend your time and where do you want to spend your money. And it begins to create this leisure culture that allows people to sort of self-improve if they want, or to sort of waste their lives if they want. And this is, in my mind, sort of what the modern class is. And this is part of modernism. It's part of what you see it in The Great Gatsby, but this is something that all of the people then sort of have. And I've just got some impressionistic images I want to use to sort of suggest how this might lead to changes in culture. This is the creating of a consumer culture, right? Well, suddenly everyone has access to radio. And radio allows you to do things like participate in sports nationally. So you begin to see the creation of a national culture. Now, we see cultures emerge in in like France and Germany, but the United States was in fact so large that you didn't really have like national cultures emerge, even after the Civil War. But now suddenly, if everyone like think about this, like what makes America America? Like we have different weather patterns, we have different foods. Like some people eat lobster, some people eat beef, some people are vegetarians. Like it, well, today I would say it probably means that you can sort of whatever show that you're obsessed with, last year was Game of Thrones or whatever, right? Like everyone all over the country can watch the show at the same time and they can get on their media and they could sort of debate it. But this is the first moment when you start to see the creation of national radio shows. People all over the country can listen to the Yankees games on the radio, even though that's not their team necessarily. They're not from New York. You see the spread of kind of five and dime stores, Woolworth stores all over the country, and in like sort of small towns, places the size of Olean or Bath or Hornell, or places much smaller than Buffalo. You see the emergence of national mass market magazines. With these magazines come the sort of revolution in print advertising that I see as carrying these modern values, maybe sort of building on Oscar Wilde, right? So this is not a modern advertisement, right? I love this ad because it's a sort of old school pre-World War I advertisement, or at least in mentality. And if you look at the advertisement, what's being advertised is the car and the engine and power, right? Advertising after this shift undergoes a revolution, and they start to advertise like the beauty of the ride and the romance of the curves of the automobile and the sort of how will people look at you if you drive this car. It's less about the car and more about the experience, right? And here you can see classic advertising from the 1920s that signals this shift in values, right? That you have technology that allows you to have shaving cream in a stick rather than having to mix the powder every morning before you shave. Well, why would you advertise this? Well, you'd advertise this by saying, well, millions of people all over America are doing this. Don't you want to be just like them? And you could sort of use this mass cultural pressure to get you to do it, right? This is especially true in terms of the way they advertise to women. Women are now presented in women's magazines as having value because of, in my mind, fairly shallow things about, the way that you look, wear your makeup, or the way that you kind of smell, or the way that you have your soap makes you feel. And I think this is subtly subversive of old kind of cultural values. Men, women in Victorian society we're kind of taught to have value because of how hard they worked, because they possessed inner strength of character, because they were able to do things that Lincoln and Frederick Douglass and John Stuart Mill did. They were self-made creatures, right? Well, the advertising in a sort of a consumer-oriented society says you have value based on what you spend and how you look. Now, there's a broader sort of revolution in social values that you can catch if you watch 1920s silent films. Most of you would find the pacing really boring, but these are movies and these are pre-censorship code. So they generally tend to have this edgy morality. I mean, Son of the Sheik doesn't seem like all of that edgy today, right? But you have this very light-skinned blonde woman who's in love with this. He's an Italian actor, but he's made to look Arab. And so this is, in the minds of people in the 1920s, this sort of interracial romance. And it was designed to sort of blow up traditional kind of ideas about American white Anglo-Saxon Protestant identity. There's also the sort of image that you get here from Clara Bow of the flapper girl, right? And here I want to kind of just take a second and pause and talk about this transformation in gender roles that's occurring. Now, when we talked about, the novel Frankenstein, or we talked a little bit about John Stuart Mill, I really emphasized the role of kind of different sort of feminism in the 19th century. It was presumed that men and women had really different roles, that women's roles were emotional and virtuous and supporting and religious, and men were essentially doing war. And the man goes off to work in the factory. He comes home to this house with the white picket fence. And there's men and women lived in really different spheres. But one of the things that you start to get in the 1920s, and it happens gradually. One of the things is a radical transformation in fashion. I've got these images here of Queen Victoria and an American woman from the age of Queen Victoria, where curves and these impossibly thin waists were in style. And you jump ahead to sort of gender roles. These are pictures from the 1890s. And suddenly women were seen essentially as being like, they're still different than men, but they begin to sort of celebrate women's form and athleticism in different ways. It began to be a little more fashionable to be thin, but you still want that hourglass figure, right? When you get to the 1920s, body image radically changes, right? And so what's suddenly really popular is this image of a flapper, where women are supposed to be boy-like. They're supposed to be razor thin. Instead of wearing corsets to enhance their figure, they're binding their bodies to kind of flatten them. And what becomes socially acceptable is a sort of different image of women. Now, like, most women don't conceive of themselves as flappers. It's probably 10 to 25% of the American public. But the idea is, yeah, like we're gonna do what men do. So women smoke. Smoking becomes acceptable at this point in time. Women as philosophers, women as literary figures. I mean, the Life magazine piece there is a bit of a satire, like it's sort of making fun of the flapper girl. But this is a major shift in terms of the way that society portrayed itself. This is also the age in which it became socially acceptable to go on dates for the first time, right? So men and women sort of encountered each other before the 1920s, by and large through the Victorian rituals of courtship, which you got a detailed picture of by reading The Importance of Being Earnest. Well, in this moment, suddenly that stops. And you can actually go and watch the movie It, starring Clara Bow. If you Google movie It, you'll get Stephen King's thing. But if you Google movie It, Clara Bow, you'll get the movie. It's about 90 minutes long, and it's sort of filled with these new relationships and these new ideas of modern women living independently in the city. Like their lives are sort of freed by the industrial process. They can work in department stores. They're sort of, and they get to sort of forge their own identities, and they don't necessarily depend on these old rules of courtship. Now, so this is a society I hope I'm painting where there's rapid transformation. And in fact, in the United States, then, there is massive cultural conflict between forces over how America should move forward. So you see this also in Germany, you see it in England to some extent. So let me give you three different examples of what that cultural conflict looks like in the US, and then I'll probably wrap this up. So the first is in the debate about prohibition. The people who were in favor of prohibition in the 19th century were progressives. They believed, like the abolitionists, that they ought to legislate morality, that you ought to do it for the sake of everyone, and that this was generally seen as a woman's issue, that women wanted to regulate this so that they could protect their families and they could protect their husband from the influence of the tavern and the saloon, right? And this was something that white Anglo-Saxon Protestant women overwhelmingly supported. Irish and Italian families, not so much. German families, not on your life. It was this sort of ethnic tension in American politics. European immigrants favored drinking. And by and large, people who would have Native Americans, people who were born in the United States and whose families had been in the United States 50 or 60 years, were in favor of it. And then they tried prohibition during World War I, using the power of the government to achieve something that would have been difficult in peacetime. They amend the Constitution to achieve this. We have a decade and a half long prohibition experiment in America. And the scholarship on this gets really heated. So some people are going to say you can't legislate morality. Prohibition was a failure. It created organized crime. What a terrible thing. But other scholars actually are quick to note that drinking actually was cut in half. Legal drinking, that and I don't have the stats in front of me, so this is ballpark, but I think your average alcohol consumption in America before Prohibition was about 2 gallons of alcohol, 2 gallons of spirit per person per year. And that's measured as pure alcohol. So like 2 gallons of vodka or so many more gallons of beer or whatever is reasonably common among working adults. And by when Prohibition was reinstated in 1933, it had fallen to less than a gallon per person. And what's more interesting is that who drank actually transformed. So in America before Prohibition, the elites were largely Victorian Christian moralists and didn't participate in this, and it was the working classes that drank. After Prohibition, well, the saloons have been shut down, and it's the people who now drink are the modern kind of elites. If you've read Great Gatsby or watched it, you sort of get the sense that, yeah, and what is drank is replaced. It used to be beer was the drink of choice in America. And then afterward, it's like something on Jeeves and Wooster. It's cocktails, right? It's the martini. And so that's sort of the sophistication of the urban elites who think they know better than the conventional morality is a sign that something has fundamentally changed. The war doesn't just engineer that, but war was the catalyst for the Prohibition experiment. War also catalyzed another experiment in American history. For the first time, immigration is radically restricted. America had had nearly completely open immigration between the 1890s and World War I, essentially. And there are moments where immigration sort of tamps down a little bit, like during the Civil War, people aren't as excited about coming. But it always opens up. And in part, people want to come to America because it gives them refuge from the political instability of Europe, from the wars, from the draft in places like Austria-Hungary or Prussia and Russia, from the religious pogroms against the Jews. But then starting in 1917, again, there's a literacy test that's passed to keep kind of Anglo-Saxons out of the United States. And this is something that's sort of done by the progressive elites. And then the people get behind it. And then lo and behold, fast forward another decade, And it seems like the elites have changed their mind. There was this celebrity trial in 1927 over the conviction of two Italian anarchists, Sacco and Vanzetti, who'd been accused of murdering a policeman. Um, Now, it seems to me that they probably actually did it. The evidence suggests that they were making bombs in their basement, and they probably were the people. But the ACLU is sort of the American Civil Liberties Union, sort of created out of this. So something really crucial seems to again happen in the 1920s, and this sort of the essence of what is meant by a liberal seems to transform. Now, the space where this transformation is the most clear to me is the space where we get to Christianity. So one of the hot button cultural moments of the 1920s was the Scopes trial in Dayton, Tennessee, I want to say in 1925. Now, in Tennessee, sort of in reaction against the Darwinist revolution, the Tennessee legislature had passed a law criminalizing the teaching of evolution in the public schools. And this was something that in rural America and in the Midwest in particular had been tremendously popular. And so one of the great progressive politicians of the Victorian era, William Jennings Bryan, you see here, stepped in to defend, to prosecute and to represent the forces of Christianity. Now, Bryan had been one of the most progressive Americans in the last 40 years. He campaigned in favor of getting off the gold standard. He campaigned in favor of the working man. He campaigned against entering World War I. And yet in 1925, something amazing has happened. And he's sort of battled against by Clarence Darrow, who's a famous liberal defense attorney. And what sort of seems like it's on trial in 1925 is less evolution than creationism and Christianity. Darrow famously puts William Jennings Bryan on the stand and asks him his opinions about the Bible. And as this story is sort of told in American newspapers like the New York Times or the Baltimore Sun, it's Christians who are being made fun of. And all over America, sort of upper middle class Americans sort of begin to tell themselves, well, I'm not like one of those people. And the cultural chasm over these issues of suddenly it seems like faith and science are very, very far apart. And this in some ways is the collapse of this is the end of an evangelical revival movement that had been taking place in America since the days of John Wesley, but it's since the Great Awakening that we talked about last time we did an America lecture, right? And there's this sort of moral transformation that this represents in America. So if you lived in Manhattan and you were a stockbroker, or maybe you taught at a university, or you were a member of the elite, if you had a problem with your parents or your boss, you would be increasingly less likely to go to your pastor or your mother to ask for advice. And increasingly, you would go and see a psychologist and someone who is trained by a Freudian and lay down on their couch and get psychoanalyzed. The idea would be that science was going to provide you the answers and insight into your subjective moral personality, or you might pick up a magazine and read it and take a quiz. There's a sense among American religious elite, symbolized by Harry Emerson Fosdick, who's I think he's a leading Baptist pastor from the 1920s, that Christianity sort of needed to be kept up to date. That so he began to espouse what we would call modernist faith. That we shouldn't insist on the historicity of the virgin birth or the miracles anymore. That educated people didn't believe these sorts of things. Now, most Americans thought this was, well, nuts. And so at least a strong minority, I don't say most Americans didn't know what to think. But a large number of biblically motivated conservatives actually at this point unplugged from culture. And they took as their inspiration a little book that J. Gresham Machen wrote in 1923 called Christianity and Liberalism. Machen argued that people like Fosdick had stepped so far away from a belief in a supernatural Jesus that they basically weren't Christians anymore. And that it would be better for them to sort of stop trying to control national politics and culture
and stick to their own churches and stick to their own institutions. And so there was a sort of call to separatism and to separate the life of faith from the life of science. And so the fundamentalists sort of signaled this large dropout from mass culture. It's a really controversial moment in American history and in American religious history. So the elites in the 30s and 40s and 50s are, generally speaking, more secular and European in their orientation than at any other point in American history. Now, as we'll talk about later on in this semester, the religious folks come back. I'll try to mention the next time I do a lecture on America that, say, someone like Billy Graham certainly was trying to move out of this fundamentalist space and back toward an evangelicalism that emphasized, the gospel and forgiveness and grace, but also kind of political relevance of evangelicalism. But the fundamentalists sort of retreat into their sections of American society. Houghton is a rather unique place because Houghton in the 1920s certainly wasn't dominated by fundamentalism, but neither then was it dominated by sort of a liberal faith. It was this sort of exception of a place that was still trying to be evangelical, and it sort of was one of the institutions that tried to insist on it maintaining both the old kind of abolitionist desire to serve social justice, but also at the same time fidelity to scripture and to a kind of and that's sort of America is certainly unique at this point in time, not only because we're the richest and most powerful country in the world, because we seem to be the country that's also simultaneously the most ambivalent about Modernism. Europeans are really shaken up by the war. And so to look at that more closely, I want to turn to this novel by Rebecca West and examine the kind of how does this affect the West, and especially how does this affect Europe? That's what we'll do for our discussion on Friday. But I'd also really encourage you to turn to the quiz that I gave you in the lecture and write me a general response to the question I'm asking for the quiz this week. And I look forward to our conversations based on the book. Thanks very much. I hope you have